Today, we'll be working with SAS assignment statements. As part of this, we're going to be working with the dataset called apt_hunt.sas7b. It's important to note that this dataset is already in the SAS format, so we'll need to read it into SAS in a different way from the in-file statements we've used in the past. Let's go to SAS and read in this dataset. I'm going to read in this dataset with a data step this time. A data step starts with the word data, and then we specify the name of the new dataset. So in this case, we're going to call this lesson 4. And with a semicolon. Now, in order to read the dataset in, we're going to use a set statement. Because this dataset is already in SAS format, we don't need to tell SAS anything additional about the dataset other than where to find it. So let's do that now. This dataset is in a folder in my box folder, and so I'm going to highlight the path to that dataset using the Explorer window. I'm going to copy that path and paste it into SAS. Because we need to point this to the actual dataset, I'm going to add to that path the dataset name with the file extension and end with a semicolon. Finally, we add the run statement, and now we can run this code. We can see that the data were read in properly. We don't see any errors in the log. And if we go to our work folder in our libraries, we can see that the dataset exists. It's called Lesson 4. And if we open it up, we can see that there are various variables here associated with an apartment hunt. So I have which apartment it was, I have the number of bedrooms, whether it had a driveway, whether it had a lawn, if it was near campus, the cost of the rent, the cost of the electricity, the cost of cable, and then the square footages for the bedrooms depending on the different numbers of bedrooms that existed. And finally, the number of baths. Important to note is that there are a couple of variables that look like all numbers, but are actually in the character format. So for number of bedrooms, you can see that these are all integers, all numbers. However, if we double click, we can see that they're left aligned, so we know that SAS is probably interpreting that as a character variable. If we double click on the variable name, we can confirm that the type is indeed character. And that's going to be important for when we convert variables from character to numeric later on. The SAS assignment statement is a way to create a new variable. So we're going to start by creating a new dataset so that we can create some new variables in this dataset. I always recommend creating a new dataset rather than overwriting an old dataset, because if you were to make an error in your code and you overwrite your old dataset, you could lose all of your data. So we're going to call this new dataset Lesson 4A, and we're going to get the data from that from the dataset that we just read in, Lesson 4. So the data step is always telling SAS to create a new dataset. The set statement is telling SAS where to get the data from for that new dataset. Now we're going to create a variable that is the sum of the electricity and the cable variable so that we can determine the total amount of utilities for these apartments. I'm going to call this new variable utils, and in this case I'm going to use the arithmetic function for calculating this. Arithmetic just means that we're going to give SAS the formula for a sum rather than using any of SAS's inbuilt functions for doing this. When I say we're going to give the formula for a sum, it's just like it sounds. We're going to do elec plus cable. And we use the plus sign to indicate that we want SAS to sum those two variables. We're going to run that and look at our results. If I run that code, We should see a new data set appear in the work window, and we do. It's called Lesson 4A. We can check our log to see that it looks like everything went okay. We see no green messages, which would be indicative of warnings, or any errors, so no red text that indicates an error. If we open this data set, our new variable will be created at the far right-hand side, and we can see that there are some missing values that have been created as part of this. That has to do with the fact that there are missing values in some of our utilities variables. When you use the arithmetic type functions, whenever you use the actual formulas for calculating, SAS will ignore places where you have missing values and set those to missing. This can be useful if you only want SAS to calculate the formula for complete data. Another way to create a summary variable like this would be to use the data step in conjunction with a numeric function. Numeric functions are built-in functions in SAS that allow you to do lots of different mathematical functions on your variables. So let's create a new variable called utils2, and this time we'll use the numeric function sum. I'm going to use the sum of function, and that's what it looks like, and then you put in your variable names, being sure to keep a space between the of and the first variable name, and a space in between each additional variable name. We're going to run this code, and you'll notice again that I've created the new dataset lesson 4B using the old dataset lesson 4A so that I don't overwrite lesson 4A. And this is important because if I were to make an error in my code, lesson 4A would be lost completely if I just overwrote the data. If we run that code, we see that we get no errors, and we can open the data set. Now utils2 is our new variable, which is the sum using the numeric function in SAS. We can compare the values in utils2 to our original variable, and what you'll see is that in the numeric functions, SAS actually ignores or actually includes missing values. So in this case, SAS has computed the sum of elect and cable for this place where we have a missing value for cable. In this case, it just took the sum of the one number that existed, 42. And you can see that this exists across all of our missing values. This is important because there are times when it might make sense to have SAS include those data that exist rather than ignoring it and setting things equal to missing. Each time that you create a new variable, you'll have to consider whether it's important to have values set to missing, or more important to have the data exist if it's there. This is a case-by-case basis and is going to depend very much on what type of variable you need to create. Finally, the final part of the lesson today is on converting variables from character to numeric. Next week, we'll talk more about actually creating summary variable or recoding variables from numeric into character, since that's a little more complicated and requires the if-then-else statement, which is covered in lesson 5. So for this last code, we will go through and create a new data set. We're going to call it lesson 4C, and it's going to be based on the data set lesson 4B. When we want to convert a character variable to a numeric variable, there are several ways to do this. The website covers the put statement. I'd like to cover a different version where we create a new variable based on a character variable that will be numeric. So in this case, we're going to create a new variable for the number of bedrooms that is no longer character but is actually numeric. We always give this new variable a new name, and that is because we don't want to overwrite the old variable. Just like with data sets, if you overwrite a variable and you do it wrong, SAS could potentially set that entire variable to missing, which would mean that you lose all of that data and information and would have to start over. So in this case, we're going to create a new variable called beds. We're going to set it equal to our old variable, which was called nbeds, and we're going to put in the multiplication sign times 1. This tells SAS to take and multiply 1 by each of those values in the nbeds variable. And what this will do is convert that variable to numeric from its current character format. Now we'll highlight this code and run it. And we should see a new data set appear called Lesson 4C, which is what we created here. And we also see that we have a note in our log that says that character values have been converted to numeric. And if we open the data set, we'll have to scroll because our new variable will appear at the end. And we see that our new variable called beds exists and that the format is now numeric. We can tell that because the variable is now aligned to the right as opposed to the left, but we can confirm that by double-clicking on the variable name and seeing that the format has indeed changed. The type is now numeric. We could also do all of this in one whole statement. We don't have to limit ourselves to one piece of code in each of our data steps. So as a last example, I'm going to create a data set called Lesson 4D, but I'm going to start at the beginning with my data set called Lesson 4. This time I'm going to create each of those variables all at the same time. So first we have our arithmetic calculation for our variable utils. We have our numeric function calculation for our variable called utils2. And we have our numeric conversion for the variable beds. Now if we run that code, we'll see a data set appear called Lesson 4D. And we see a few notes in our log that should reflect the same things that we saw earlier as we work through each of those different pieces of code. We have the character conversion to numeric. We also have that some missing values were generated, which was part of our arithmetic function where we summed up elect plus table. If we open that data set, we can see that now all three of those variables exist, and they're all in the correct formats and are identical to what we computed as part of Lesson 4, as part of the data set for Lesson 4C. And that's the end of this tutorial on assignment statements.